There's nothing like the excitement of driving a rare and legendary car like this 1964 Automobili Turismo Sport 2500 GT. You can only find cars like this on the Audrain Museum Network. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe now. Press the subscribe button and click the bell icon to be notified when we put up more great new content like this ATS drive. Come and join us now. Thanks. If you love classic cars, then Donald loves you. I'm here with the ATS GTS. Automobili Turismo Sport was a fascinating example of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. At the end of 1961, Ferrari was on top of the world. They had won the World Championship in Formula One with Phil Hill, they had won the World Sports Car Championship, and their leading engineers were in revolt. Carlo Chiti and Giotto Bizzarini had had enough of Enzo Ferrari and his high-handed ways. They decided they could do it better alone. With a group of very highly financed backers, including Count Volpi of Venice, they decided to start a company to beat Ferrari at his own game. And they would build Formula One cars that would beat the Ferraris that they had just designed and build a fast sports racing car as well for the wealthy sportsmen and to race in the Sports Car Racing Championship. The result was the ATS 100, a very interesting looking Formula One car that had singular, disastrous effect on the track, and this incredibly beautiful ATS GT. They made two versions, the ATS GT for the road and the ATS GTS, a light alloy sport version for racing. Their plans were quite ambitious. They had this beautiful body designed by Franco Scaglione, who would later go on to do very interesting work with one of the ATS engineering partners, but in typical Scaglione fashion, this car looks as if it's fluid metal itself. It seems to be racing along the ground, just standing still. And the ATS 2500 GT also had the distinction of being only the second mid-engine sports car for the road, beat only by a few months by the Matra Jet. This car and a sister car ran in the 1964 Targa Florio, where unfortunately they dropped out on the second lap.
Sorprendente come mai la 48esima edizione della Targa Florio. I 10 infernali giri del circuito delle Madonie questa volta hanno messo fuori combattimento alla metà dei 64 piloti che hanno preso il via alla più vecchia corsa del mondo.
Now you may think, a sports car that drops out in the second lap. This is the Targa Florio. It happened to be a lap of Sicily, so the laps are rather long, but nevertheless, this car also did not see the kind of success that they had hoped for. In the end, the entire operation only lasted 2 years. The backers had lost faith, they had not had the results they wanted to in Formula One or in sports car racing, and everyone just decided, let's just move on. Count Volpi continued with the projects for a little while under the Scuderia Serenissima banner and built a few more cars, but it is generally acknowledged that of the 24 or so chassis built, there were probably only 6 or 12 ATS cars built. We only know about 6, and this is one of 3 of the alloy racing models. This car, again, is something that shows the clear development of the Italian racing model from the late 1950s that can be seen in some of the Ferrari and Maserati racing models, allied to the coming mid-engine revolution. The form of this car is so incredibly well balanced as well. Very few cars would be designed as a mid-engine design to have the kind of balance that the ATS GT has. And as I said before, people went on from the ATS project to greater things. Giotto Bizzarini, of course, went to work for Lamborghini and later working for himself, building cars under his own name. Carlo Chiti went on quite famously to found Autodelta, which was the racing arm of Alfa Romeo, and in fact, this engine was developed into the race-winning and championship-winning Alfa 33 engine as used in the great 33 race cars and the brilliant 33 Stradale car, another one of Franco Scaglione's great beauties. So this car is in very, very, very real sense the progenitor of some of the most successful and beautiful race and sports cars of the 1960s and 70s. An important part of bringing back to life the cars from the Nick Begovich collection is the preservation of the evidence of what Nick Begovich used these cars for and how he preserved them. However, there are a few exceptions in the collection in which we are not preserving the cars as we discovered them and bought them from the Nick Begovich collection. This is probably one of the most notable of those cases, and it's the ATS. And we're here with Brian Oliver, one of the principals of automotive restorations here in Stratford, Connecticut. And Brian, when we first brought this car to your shop, we took a very careful look at it, and of course, I really wanted to preserve it just as I saw it. It's one of my favorite cars from the collection, and as you and your team got into it, we went in a totally different direction. Why?
And the reason was, or is, the corrosion that we found, underneath the chassis once we got it started to disassemble. We realized at that point we couldn't preserve it because we were losing what we were preserving. So it was we had to make the decision to, really go with a full restoration. So.
And that's a very interesting point because obviously today people are very attuned to preservation.
Yes.
And obviously we are honoring in our exhibition engineering plus design equals passion, the Nick Begovich collection.
Yes.
Nick's vision of why he acquired these cars and why he kept these cars. But it is also important to sort of not try to preserve decay.
Correct.
And so how do you make that decision? What are the key points?
That's a good question. When we look at a restoration, the most important part of it is structure and body. Do we have corrosion that's going to be a safety concern? If overall the paint's okay and we don't have anything corroding through, a frame issue or a floor issue, at that point you can preserve it. But this having the sort of corrosion that it does or did with the aluminum and the steel structure, that was the decision that had to be made. Unfortunately, it couldn't be preserved. So
that's another very interesting thing because a lot of people think, not obviously the incredibly involved and knowledgeable enthusiasts who are watching this video, but a lot of people think, oh, if a car is alloy, then it doesn't rust.
Yes.
But of course, the entire car is not made of alloy.
Correct.
And alloy and steel aren't friends.
No, they're not. No, they corrode just like you would expect. So, or you would hope it doesn't, but it does when they make contact. So.
And it's very interesting because at the beginning of this video, we see the car as it was first delivered from California to our storage facility in Virginia.
Yeah.
I'm standing next to the car, beaming because this is one of my favorite cars in the entire collection, and the car just looks beautiful. It looks like, oh, Donald's just going to hop in and drive away.
Sure.
And that's how sort of the car looked to me. Tired, certainly, but just sort of tired from sitting. And when the car got here and you took it apart, and I saw underneath, especially the way this car happens to be built, which is very typical of Italian GT cars of the period, with these tubular frames, and really neat to me, the fact that the fuel tanks are the sills, which is so incredibly safe.
Oh, absolutely,
So what did you see when the car started to come apart that helped us in this decision?
The issue, once we got the car here and we're really able to take a look at it, that it had already started to be disassembled or was coming back after a reassembly, and that we weren't sure. So at that point, everything became sort of suspect, whether the brakes, suspension components, ball joints, things like that. We didn't know at what stage they were in, especially with the engine being apart, gearbox was drained. So that was a big concern, and everything was going to have to be touched at that point and reviewed. So that was, again, the decision to just do it and go all the way. We had some issues with the harness, when you start patching that, it becomes an issue and you just keep chasing it. So, it was at that point to say, let's just do this and do it right and do it once.
And obviously, as you know, because you're very familiar with the cars from the Audrain collections, you have been tasked with helping us to preserve and honor these cars because we like to drive them. We like to use them, not abuse them, but certainly we want to make sure that they can function as their makers intended. And of course, this was the high performance version of the ATS GT.
Correct.
And so this is a car that's really designed to perform at a very high level. So it's the kind of thing that you obviously want to look at to make sure that it can be as safe as possible. Now, the state that we're seeing it in right now, where are we in the restoration process at this point?
Where we are, the disassembly has obviously been complete. The body has been stripped. We as I mentioned to you, we go over with a DA and do it by hand to get the majority of the material off, and then we dust it over with a plastic media to get all the nooks and crannies. And now it has been etch primed, and as you see, we've masked off certain areas where there's issues in the body. You know, this will all have to be welded, so that's why those areas were left bare. So that's where we are in this sort of the body process. The harness has already been done. You know, we've taken the original, dissected it, and built a new one. Brakes are, I believe, on the shelf. They're rebuilt, ready to go. Control arms, all those components have been crack tested, bushings, you know, so as the body continues on, you know, the engine is being rebuilt, you know, all these things are happening simultaneously. So
now let's talk about the fact that this is a car from 1963. And it is an alloy car.
Yes.
So in an instance like this, where you have some cracking in the original alloy, how do you deal with that?
What we do is we cut this area out and we will weld in a new piece of aluminum at that point, yeah. And what will happen is this piece will become a little bit larger than you see here to get to, you know, good, a little thicker area. And it's common to have that, especially in the corners. So
let's take a look at what the way this body was built tells us once you've gotten it stripped. I mean, Franco Scaglione is one of my absolute favorite designers.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the most beautiful Italian GT cars of the 1960s.
Yeah.
They built Italian GT cars in this period in a very, very specific way. How does that impact the way you restore a car like this?
That's a good question. You know, we look at, you know, the concern is that we don't over-restore it. You know, if you look in here, the different welds and, you know, how this was done, this is factory, you know, and it's a bit crude, but that is one of the concerns, is that we don't go beyond what they did, you know, and preserve this sort of cuts and different things, you know, that they did, as you could tell as they were putting this car together, that they had to do, you know, sort of an afterthought almost. You see a lot of that in this car, but being so limited, it's expected.
And that's one of the great stories of ATS and a car like this, the fact that every one of the, depending on what sources you use,
Yeah.
6 or 12 cars that were built, they're all prototypes.
Yeah.
I mean, if they had gone into larger scale production,
Yeah.
it's probably likely they would not have continued to build the cars the way they did.
Correct.
There are some great mysteries, and we'll see this, how we solve those mysteries
Yeah.
later in the restoration process.
Yes.
But one of the things was the fact that there were 2 button covers in the cowl.
Yeah.
And we've had long discussions about
Yeah.
why they were there. Were they for a windshield washer placement, a windshield wiper placement, rather that they decided to change, or what were they?
Yeah.
They're just there.
They're there, yeah, and I believe that the wipers, the idea where they wanted to put them or the mechanism changed, and that was the way to cover it up, you know.
And that's the way we'll leave it. You will
Yes.
put covers back on the
Correct.
car when the car is restored.
Yes, yep.
And one of the other things is, for a car like this, it came in a deep red.
Yes.
And as the car was stripped, you discovered some other reds underneath.
We did, yes.
And so then the decision becomes, well, which red do we choose? Is it the red that it first left the workshop?
Yeah.
The red that Nick Begovic owned the car in?
Yeah.
So those are other
Yeah.
decisions that have to be
That have
made
to be
during the
made.
restoration process.
For sure, yeah. And I think the idea of trying to preserve what Nick Begovic was doing, you know, we were going to hopefully hold that original red, or the red that it came to us in. So we've got all the spray outs for both.
It is such an incredibly exciting thing
Yeah.
to see a car like this. Plus, of course, there's the great challenge that we have laid at your feet.
Yes.
The fact that our exhibition opens in November.
Yeah.
So this car has got to be finished
Yeah.
for November.
Yeah.
What is the most challenging restoration assignment that you've had here at Automotive Restorations in
most
terms
challenging?
of time and scope?
Really, the time issue was, and you know the car well, Walter Eisenstark Seata, which had to be done in a year. You know, it was an unfortunate incident that was, the car was crashed, you know, and we had to get it done in a year, and we made it. You know, the challenge to, you know, there were no parts issues or anything like that. It was really just getting the labor done in 1 year, you know, and because during the processes, there's dry times, there's, you know, things that you can't do until, you know, certain parts are complete. So it makes it a challenge, yeah.
So this will be less challenging than that because you've got less time to finish this than you had for that, and there are no parts for an ATS.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
they're not here, then you've got to make them.
Make them, exactly, yeah. Yeah, I mean, fortunately, this was very, very complete. You know, the engine was a part a bit, but, you know, most of the parts arrived in crates, so. And we have a spare engine, so that helps, yeah.
Well, Brian, I'm really so excited to be here and also to bring our audience in on just a bit of this story. To me, I love factories, I love restoration shops. I could spend my entire life here, especially since I don't work here, so I'm interrupting everybody else's work by coming down here. Yep. As a matter of fact, the car will probably be a few days late back to the Audrain because we're sitting here having this conversation.
Which is okay.
And making it happen. But I think that it's so important for people to see and understand what goes into a finished car, a product that you see on the concours lawn, in a tour, in a vintage rally, in a vintage race, that they don't simply roll out this way. And when you see artisans like you and the people who work for you carefully restoring a car to the way that the artisans in Italy built it, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, no, we enjoy it, we do. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. And
Thank
can't
you.
wait to see it finish. I can't wait to drive this car.
Absolutely.
I cannot wait. It's going to be a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you, Donald.
Thanks. Whether or not this was the ATS 2500 GTS that ran in the 1964 Targa Florio, one of the two, we'll never know. But one thing is very clear, driving this car on the road, this is a race car. This is a car that doesn't like traffic, it likes the open road, and it just wants to go. It's happiest when it's flying along. It's also very interesting to recall the words of Ed Niles, the great collector who owned this car and chassis 1001, one of the GT cars, which he said was one of the most civilized GT cars he had ever driven. Ed Niles, the legendary collector of sports racing cars, was the second owner of this car, and he also owned chassis 1001, one of the GTs. And he shared with friends that 1001 was one of the best and most sophisticated GT cars he had ever driven, and he'd owned a lot, but that this car was a beast. It was like being in a Ferrari 250 LM. It was exactly the car that this car was made to compete with. And to think about the fact that this car was in the Targa Florio along with the Porsche 904, which eventually won, it's clear to me, as much as I love this car, and I do, this is truly a dream come true to drive this car. The experience of driving this, as opposed to the Begovic 904, could not be more vastly different. This car is really an animal. And I can't imagine the heroes that would have driven this car in a race with a 45-mile lap. Now, unfortunately, of course, both ATSs failed to finish. The one which may have been this car made a lap of the race and then succumbed to ignition problems. The other car did 2 laps. And that's not to be sneezed at, because the Targa Florio was an amazingly brutal event. But it is just amazing to consider what these cars represented. The scrappy Automobili Turismo e Sport, putting itself up against the might of Ferrari. And I think in this car, they really did have something that, if it had been developed, could have been the world beater it was designed to be. That this car is clearly built for high speeds is clear in any driving situation. And it has that very particular characteristic of a lot of 1960s sports and GT cars, in that the front end gets very light the faster you go. although this car has 2 seats, there is very much a third in the cockpit with you, and that's this engine. You feel as if you're wearing this car. This seat is just seems to be attached to that engine over my shoulder and in my ears. And on a very cool morning, it's already warm inside this car, and the car's not running hot. The car's running nice and cool, but there's not a lot of airflow. And again, to think about this as an endurance racer, it's not surprising that the endurance racers of the time might lose 10 or 15 pounds over the course of a long race. And you can see how. But in other ways, this car is remarkably civilized. The steering is very responsive, and for a mid-engine car, you also have a nice feel about the front end. You know where the wheels are all the time, and that's a very comforting thing. There's also terrific visibility, although for the ultimate, I would like to have fender mirrors, which this car does not have. But surprisingly, the interior rearview mirror is quite wide, so you get a nice view of the road behind you. This is also so incredibly emblematic of something I said many times, and I never tire of saying, that I just love this era, the very last one in which you could drive a car to the racetrack, race it, and drive it back home. And I think that we've lost a lot in sports car racing with the rise of the purely track cars. And of course, there's also nothing like a metal-gated gearbox with a great lockout, physical lockout for reverse. With a dogleg first gear, you definitely don't want to accidentally select reverse as you're going along. Mechanical mayhem would result. I think one of the other things which really helps the balance of this car, which would be almost unimaginable today, is the fact that the side sills are the gas tanks. So I'm surrounded by fuel on either side, but it also helps in terms of the balance. There's a plastic tube that runs from one tank to the other, so that unlike, for instance, in a 1950s or 60s Jaguar, where you actually selected the fuel tank from which you're going to draw fuel, this one draws fuel simultaneously from both tanks. And so, much like one of my favorite and innovative Formula One cars of 1950, the Lancia D50, with its great pannier side tanks, it really helps the balance. And although this engine does not like to be lugged, it's remarkably tractable, even here around 2,800 RPM in 4th gear. Gear, the engine is much happier, turning about 4,000 RPM, and then the revs really drop from gear to gear. It's clear that these gears are designed for the endurance racing, and especially again a race like the Targa Florio, which is a great mix of very slow twisty sections and wide open blasting sections. You need to have a car that's very versatile in its power delivery. And I think the ATS was designed for that purpose. I also have to say more than a word about these seats. I've always loved these seats, and a lot of people don't really get them. Say they're a little too small in the hip, and they don't offer enough side location because they are very short, but I think they actually support me pretty well. I'm sort of an average-sized guy, maybe slightly broad in the beam, but the races of the 1960s certainly would have been slightly smaller than I am. I think for them especially, this is a seat that would have been really comfortable for those long races. You also have a very nice relationship between the seat, the seating position, and the steering wheel. You get nice leverage here. You don't feel like you're in that super straight arms out position. Your elbows are slightly bent. And of course, the seat is adjustable as well, which is a terrific feature to have, especially in a race car. One of the things I must do is reflect on what the driving experience is, one, what I expected, and B, as satisfying as I hoped it would be. I think the answers to the first question is, it's not what I thought it would be. I should have believed Ed Niles, who was seldom wrong in these things, when he talked about the character of this car. It is rather beastly. And for the second, I do love it. The gearbox is clearly a racing gearbox, but once you get used to it, and the oil warms up, of course, it's a pretty easy piece to use. Downshifting does take some concentration and planning ahead. But the upshifts, once the oil in the gearbox is nice and warm, is really smooth. And of course, with the gated shifter, very direct. It's hard to miss a gear when you know exactly where they are. The car is remarkably responsive. And I think that by any stretch of the imagination, with the right headgear and communications, it's going to make a terrific rally car for an event like the Colorado Grand, where it can really just open up and stretch its legs. Not quite sure that's in the future for me in this car, but getting it out on the road and sharing it with all the folks watching this on the Audrain Museum Network is a thrill and a treat, and I'm honored to have had the privilege. Thank you, Nick Begovich, for preserving this car for us and allowing us to share it with millions of people around the world. This drive's for you, Nick.